My daughter held my hand at the funeral and whispered that she would always be there for me. 8 months later, when the paramedics called her from my hospital room, she let it go to voicemail. Before we get into the story, let us know where you are listening from in the comments below. It means more than you know. The morning it happened was ordinary. That is the part nobody tells you about catastrophe. It does not announce itself. It arrives on a Tuesday while you are backing your truck out at the driveway to pick up mulch from the hardware store, and then a delivery van blows the stop sign on Maple Creek Road and the world goes sideways and loud, and then perfectly, terrifyingly quiet. I came to in the ditch. My door was crumpled against my shoulder. The radio was still playing, some old gospel station my wife Evelyn had programmed in before she passed, and I had never changed it because changing it felt like erasing something I was not ready to lose. I remember thinking, even in that moment with blood on my collar and my left leg pinned, I thought Evelyn would have hated this truck. She always wanted me to get something sensible. The paramedics said I was lucky. That is a funny word for what I felt lying in the back of that ambulance with an oxygen mask on my face and my glasses bent at the bridge. Lucky. My hip was fractured. 3 ribs cracked. I had lost enough blood that they were talking about a transfusion. The young paramedic, a kid who could not have been older than 25, kept squeezing my arm and telling me to stay with him. I tried to joke. I told him I was not going anywhere. He did not laugh. That was when I understood it was serious. They got me to St. Maya, Augustine Medical Center, and moved fast. Someone cut my shirt off. Someone else was calling out numbers I did not understand, and somewhere in that controlled chaos, a nurse leaned close and asked me who they should call. My daughter, I said. Her name is Diane. I gave them the number from memory. I had been dialing it for 32 years. I want to tell you about Diane, the way I want to remember her, not the way she showed up that day, because there was a version of my daughter who used to fall asleep on my chest during thunderstorms when she was 4 years old, who cried at the airport when I dropped her off for college and made me promise to call every Sunday. That Diane existed. I raised her. I knew every freckle on her face and the exact way she laughed when something really caught her off guard. A big, unguarded laugh that she always tried to cover with her hand because she was self-conscious about it. I loved that laugh. I loved her completely. I do not know exactly when the other version took over. It happened gradually, the way a good pair of boots wears down. You do not notice it until one day you're standing in a puddle. The doctor who came to see me was a woman named Dr. Whitfield. She had the kind of calm that you develop after years of delivering news people do not want to hear. She sat on the edge of the chair beside my bed, not hovering over me the way some of them do, and she told me what was happening with my body, what they needed to do, and then she paused. She said she had tried to reach my emergency contact. I told her that was my daughter. She nodded slowly, the way people do when they are choosing their words carefully. She said she had spoken to her, that Diane had been informed of my condition, that I had lost significant blood and might need surgery, that the situation was urgent. And then Dr. Whitfield looked at the wall for just a moment, just a half-second before looking back at me. She said, my daughter told her that she was in the middle of something and would try to get there when she could. Try to get there when she could. I stared at the ceiling tiles. Someone in the hallway was laughing at something. The monitor beside me beeped its steady, indifferent rhythm. I counted the tiles to give my brain something to do that was not thinking about what I had just heard. I asked if she had said anything else. Dr. Whitfield hesitated. Then she said, very gently, that my daughter had also asked whether it was necessary for her to come in person, or whether there was someone else on staff who could handle the paperwork. Paperwork. My daughter had called my possible death a paperwork question. I did not cry. I want you to know that. I am 67 years old, and I have buried my parents and my wife and my best friend from the army, and I have learned that there is a kind of pain that does not produce tears. It sits differently, lower, like something settling into concrete and hardening there. I told Dr. Whitfield I would be fine. She said they would do everything they could. She gave my arm a brief, professional squeeze and left me alone with the monitor and a gospel station playing faintly from somewhere. No, wait. That was another memory. There was no music here, just the hum of the machines and the occasional squeak of a shoe on linoleum and the distant sound of someone else's family gathering in the hallway to be there for their person. My son-in-law called 2 days later. Not Diane, her husband Garrett. That smooth, easy smile Garrett, who had borrowed $40,000 from me 5 years ago to cover a business deal that he assured me was a sure thing, who had paid back $11,000 and then stopped mentioning it, who called me Pop on holidays and hugged me in that performative way that meant nothing. Garrett called to tell me he and Diane were thinking of me, that they were praying for my recovery, that they did not want me to worry about anything. Then he said it so casually, slipped it in between concern and goodbye like it was nothing. He mentioned that they had been talking to a financial advisor. Just getting organized, he said. Just being responsible adults. He used the phrase, estate planning. He said it was something everyone should have sorted out, especially given my age and the circumstances. Given my age and the circumstances, he was circling my money before I was even out of bed. I hung up. I lay in the dark of that hospital room, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter. Something that felt like the last warm thing in a house where you have turned off all the radiators. I had given Diane and Garrett everything they needed to build a life. The down payment on their house in Westchester. The money for Garrett's business, tutoring and tuition for their kids. My grandchildren who had stopped visiting once they got old enough to have their own opinions about where they spent their weekends. I had given until giving was a reflex, the way breathing is a reflex. I had not thought about what it meant that I was always the one giving. I picked up my phone. I called the one person I knew would pick up on the first ring. His name is Roland. We have been friends since 1987, when we both worked the same warehouse in Cleveland before I moved into sales, and he eventually became an attorney. Roland has a voice like the bottom of a barrel and a mind like a steel trap, and he answered on the first ring just the way I knew he would. He let me talk. That is one of the things I love about Roland. He lets you get it all out before he says a word. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Then he said, "Well, tell me what you want to do about it." I told him I wanted to know what my options were. I told him I wanted to know what I could do, legally, cleanly, in a way that could not be undone or argued. He said, "Give me 24 hours. I said, "I have the time." He actually laughed at that. God bless him. He laughed. Roland came to the hospital the following afternoon with a leather portfolio and 2 cups of decent coffee from the shop down the street, which told me he had planned this visit carefully because Roland does not spend money on good coffee unless the situation warrants it. He sat in the chair Dr. Whitfield had occupied, spread his papers on the tray table, and we talked for 3 hours. He had already reviewed my existing documents. He told me that what I wanted to do was entirely possible, entirely legal, and could be executed with a notary present in the hospital room, which was, he said, more common than people realized. People changed their wills in hospital rooms all the time. There was nothing unusual about it except the reason. We talked through everything. The house in Maplewood, the one Evelyn and I had bought in 1994, and where Diane had grown up, and where I had planted a dogwood tree in the backyard when she was born, a tree that was now 32 years old and taller than the roofline. The investment accounts. The life insurance. The small piece of land I owned in Virginia that had been in my family for 3 generations. I told Roland what I wanted to do with all of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you sure?" I looked at Clara. No. Evelyn. I looked at Evelyn's photograph on my phone. The one from our last anniversary trip to Asheville. Her face tipped up toward the autumn light coming through the trees. She had been the most generous person I ever knew. She would have cried over what Diane had become. She also would have understood exactly why I was doing this. I told Roland I was sure. He said, "Then let's get this done right." The notary arrived the next morning, a serious young man with a briefcase who shook my hand formally and verified my identity and witnessed everything with professional detachment. It took less than 2 hours. When it was done and the papers were signed and sealed, I felt lighter than I had since before the accident. Not happy exactly, but clear. The way air feels clear after a long rain. I slept better that night than I had in months. What I did not know was that while Roland and I were signing those papers, Diane and Garrett had finally decided to make the trip to the hospital. Not on the day I nearly bled out. Not when Dr. Whitfield called. Not when the situation was uncertain and they might have had to sit with the discomfort of not knowing whether I was going to live. They came 3 days later, when I was stable and the crisis had passed, when visiting me had become safe and convenient. I heard Garrett's voice in the hallway first, loud and easy, talking to a nurse, being charming. That was always his gift. He could make any room think he belonged there. They came in together. Diane was wearing the camel-colored coat I had bought her 2 Christmases ago. She looked good, rested, not like someone who had spent the past few days anxious about her father. Her eyes swept the room the way you scan a space when you are assessing it, and then she came to me and hugged me with the practiced warmth of someone who has thought about how a hug should look. She said, "Daddy, I'm so sorry. I got here as fast as I could." 5 days. It had been 5 days. I said, "It's all right." Garrett stood at the foot of the bed with his hands in his coat pockets and said all the right things. He said I looked good. He said the doctors were incredible. He said he was glad I was on the mend. And then, with the timing of a man who had rehearsed this in the car on the way over, he said he wanted to talk to me about a few things when I was feeling up to it. Just practical stuff. Just making sure everything was organized. I told him we could talk now if he wanted. He looked at Diane. She gave him a small nod. He sat down in Roland's chair and leaned forward and began talking about the importance of having a plan in place. He talked about how they just wanted to make sure I was taken care of, that my affairs were in order, that we were all on the same page about how things stood. He mentioned my house. He mentioned the accounts. He mentioned the land in Virginia, which surprised me. I had not realized he knew about that. He talked for a long time, and I listened. I let him go through the whole careful, rehearsed speech, and I did not interrupt, and I watched my daughter watch the floor while her husband made his case for why they should be the ones to manage what I had spent 40 years building. When he finished, I said, "You should know that I had my attorney here yesterday." The room shifted. It was subtle, but I felt it. Garrett's hands stopped moving. Diane looked up from the floor. I said, "I've made some changes to my documents. Everything is signed and notarized." Garrett said, "What kind of changes?" I said, "The kind that are legally binding." The silence that followed was different from any silence I had sat in during those 5 days in the hospital. This one had shape and weight. Diane's face did something complicated that I could not quite read. Garrett's easy expression went somewhere else, and what replaced it was not something I recognized from holiday dinners and birthday parties. He said, "Can I ask what changes?" I said, "You can ask Roland." I gave him Roland's card. My hand was steady. They left an hour later. The visit had started warm and ended with a kind of chill that no one named out loud. Diane hugged me at the door with a tightness that felt different from the first hug, and I could not tell if she was angry or scared or something she had not let herself feel yet. Garrett said goodbye without looking at me directly. The nurse who came in to check my vitals afterward said I seemed calmer than I had all week. I told her I was just tired. She said rest was the best thing for me. I agreed. Roland called that evening. He said Garrett had already left a message with his office. I said, I figured. Roland said, do you want to know what he said? I said, not particularly. Roland laughed his barrel laugh and told me to get some sleep. They discharged me 4 days later, the morning I left. I took my time getting dressed. Slowly, carefully, each movement deliberate because my hip was still tender, and my ribs reminded me of their presence with every breath. I folded the thin hospital blanket and set it at the foot of the bed out of habit, the way Evelyn had always made the bed with corners so precise you could bounce a quarter off them. I had inherited that compulsion somewhere along the decades of being married to her. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment before I stood. I looked at the room. The scuffed floor, the institutional curtain, the chair where Roland had sat, the window with its view of the parking garage and a single strip of March sky above it. I had lain in this room and made the hardest decision I had made since deciding to stop waiting for my children to become who I needed them to be. I felt, sitting there, the particular freedom of a man who has already done the hard thing. The aide brought a wheelchair for the trip to the entrance, hospital policy, and I rode it without argument because some battles are not worth having. She was a cheerful woman named Frances with elaborate braids and a warm laugh, and she talked the whole way down about the weather warming up finally, about her sister visiting from Atlanta, about how she liked my hat. I had forgotten I was wearing a hat. Evelyn had given it to me. I touched the brim without thinking. The cab was waiting. The driver asked where I was headed. I gave him the address and sat back and watched the city move past the windows, the early spring light thin and pale, people on the sidewalks with their shoulders still up around their ears against the cold, the world going on in its ordinary way without any awareness that I had been missing from it for 12 days. I was going home, to a house that Diane and Garrett no longer had a key to because I had asked Roland to arrange for the locks to be changed while I was in the hospital. I had not told them. I had not announced it. I'd simply had it done, quietly. The way you handle things when you've finally stopped performing normalcy for people who do not deserve the performance. My phone rang. Diane's name on the screen. I watched it ring. She left a voicemail. Then a text, then another voicemail. Then Garrett sent a text that was cordial in the way that texts from lawyers are cordial, all careful wording and implied threat, wrapped in a layer of concern. I did not respond to any of them. Not that day. The cab pulled up to my house on Sycamore Street, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at it. The dogwood in the side yard was not yet in bloom, too early in the season, but the buds were there, tight and waiting. In 6 weeks it would be white with flowers, the way it was every spring, the way it had been every spring for 32 years. I had planted it the week we brought Diane home from the hospital. I had stood in the backyard with a newborn who could not hold up her own head, and a tree that was barely a sapling, and believed, with my whole chest, that I was building something permanent. I had built something. Just not what I thought. I went inside. The house was quiet in the good way that houses are quiet when they are yours. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard and let the quiet settle around me like something I had earned. I called Roland that evening and we talked for an hour. He told me the documents were rock solid. He told me that if Diane and Garrett pursued any legal challenge, they would not find much traction, and that he was prepared to handle whatever came. I thanked him. He told me to stop thanking him and eat something decent. I warmed up a can of soup. I sat at the kitchen table where Evelyn and I had eaten 10,000 meals together, and I ate my soup, and I did not cry. I thought about the community center over on Vine Street that had been trying to get their after-school program expanded for 2 years and could not find the funding. I thought about the veterans housing nonprofit that Roland had mentioned to me once, quietly because he knew my history and knew I had always meant to do more. I thought about the small college scholarship fund my church had been building, $20 here and $50 there from people who could not afford much, for kids in the neighborhood who had potential and no runway. I thought about what it meant to leave something behind that would outlast you in the right way. The paperwork Roland and I had finalized named 4 beneficiaries: the Vine Street Community Center, the Veterans Horizon Housing Initiative based out of Columbus, the First Grace Church Scholarship Fund, and a small land trust in Virginia set up to preserve the family property and eventually convert it into a retreat space for children in foster care. That one had been Roland's idea, and when he suggested it, I had gotten very quiet for a moment because it was exactly right. My daughter was not named. My son-in-law was not named. I had not erased them to punish them. I want to be careful to say that, because it matters. What I did was not an act of vengeance. Vengeance is noisy. Vengeance wants to be witnessed. What I did was quieter than that. I simply decided that the things I had worked for deserved to go to people who would use them. That love without reciprocity is not an obligation that runs in one direction forever, and that 67 years old is not too late to choose differently. Diane came to the house on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after my discharge. She came alone, without Garrett, which told me something. She stood on the porch in that camel coat, and she rang the bell the way you ring someone's doorbell when you are not sure if you are welcome. And I stood in the entry hall for a moment before I opened the door. We sat at the kitchen table. I made coffee. Old habit. She talked for a long time. She cried, which I had not expected, and the tears were real. I know my daughter well enough to know real tears from performed ones, and these were real. She talked about fear, about how she had frozen when the hospital called, about how she had convinced herself I would be fine, about how Garrett had told her not to panic and she had listened to him when she should have listened to herself. She talked about the $40,000 in a way she never had before, acknowledging it directly without the careful vagueness that had surrounded it for 5 years. She said she knew what they had done. She said she was ashamed. I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt. When she finished, I said, "I believe you." She looked at me with something that might have been hope, and I understood then that I had to be very careful with what I said next. I said, "I believe that you mean what you're saying right now, and I need you to understand that believing you doesn't undo what happened. I was in that hospital room for 12 days, Diane. 12 days. And I had a lot of time to think about what our relationship has been and what it hasn't been, and I've made my decisions based on that thinking." She asked about the will. She asked it quietly, not the way Garrett would have asked it, but still she asked. I said the documents were finalized and I was not going to discuss the specifics. I told her that what I chose to do with what I had earned was not something that required her approval or her understanding. She cried again. She said she loved me. I believe that too, in the complicated, insufficient way that had always characterized what was between us. I told her that I loved her. I told her that love was not the question. The question was what we did with it. She left an hour later. She hugged me at the door, and this time the hug was nothing like the first one in the hospital room. This one was uncertain and a little desperate and entirely human, and I held on to it for a moment because she was still my daughter. She was still the baby I had brought home 32 years ago and planted a tree for. But I did not change the documents. Roland called that afternoon. Because Roland has good timing, I told him about the visit. He listened without comment. Then he asked how I was doing, and he meant it, not as a formality, but as a real question from a real friend. I thought about it honestly. I said I was doing better than I had in a long time. That I had not expected that I thought doing the hard thing would feel harder, and instead it felt like putting down a weight I had carried so long I had stopped noticing how much it cost me. He said that sounded about right. I said I was thinking about getting involved with the Vine Street Center. Showing up, not just writing a check, maybe helping with the after-school kids a few afternoons a week once my hip healed up. Roland said that sounded like me. I said I didn't know what came next for Diane and me, that I was leaving that open, that I was not interested in permanent estrangement any more than I was interested in pretending the past 5 years had not happened, that somewhere in between there was probably something real if she chose to look for it. He said that was generous. I said it was just honest. The dogwood bloomed 6 weeks later, right on schedule, white flowers against the April sky. I sat on the back porch with my coffee on a warm morning and watched a pair of sparrows argue over the bird bath Evelyn had installed in 1999. The concrete one, shaped like a leaf, that I had always threatened to replace with something more practical, and never did. The yard was a little ragged from the winter. I needed to get out there. My hip was not all the way back yet, but it was getting there. I thought about all the things I still wanted to do. That was the thing nobody had warned me about. Surviving something like that, doing the hard things, clearing the air, you end up on the other side with more space than you expected. Space for something you had not planned. I was not done. That was what I knew. Sitting there with my coffee while the sparrows bickered and the dogwood flowered and the spring light came slow and certain over the fence, I picked up my phone. Not to call Diane. Not yet. I called the director of the Vine Street Center, a woman who had left me 2 messages about setting up a time to talk. Her name was Barbara, and she answered on the second ring with the kind of energy that told me she ran on purpose and very little sleep. I told her my name. I told her I had some time on my hands and some things I wanted to discuss. She said, "Mr. Webb, I was hoping you'd call." I smiled at the dogwood. I said, "Well, here I am. I keep thinking about that dogwood tree. I planted it the week we brought Diane home from the hospital 32 years ago, and for 3 decades I watched it come back every spring without fail. White flowers against whatever sky April decided to give us. And I never once thought of it as anything other than permanent. That is what you believe when you plant something for a child. You believe in permanence. You believe the thing you are building will hold. What I understand now, sitting on the back porch with my coffee going cold, is that the tree was always going to come back. It was my daughter who changed, and the difference between those 2 things took me longer to see than it should have. I do not think Diane was born indifferent. I raised her. I know what she was capable of feeling, but somewhere along the years of making things easy for her, of writing the check before she finished asking, of smoothing every rough edge so she would never have to feel the friction of real consequence, I taught her something I did not mean to teach. I taught her that love was a transaction that only ran one direction. That I would give and she would receive, and the balance would never need to be settled. That was not her failure. That was mine first. The phone call she let go to voicemail while I was losing blood on a table in St. Sainta, Augustine Medical Center. That was the result of something I had been building for 30 years without knowing it. You cannot give a person everything they want and then be surprised when they start to believe they are owed it. Cause and effect does not stop working just because the people involved are family. What saved me was not anger. Anger would have made me want her to suffer, and I am not interested in her suffering. What saved me was clarity, The kind of clear thinking you only get when you are lying in a hospital bed with 3 cracked ribs and nothing to do but be honest with yourself. I thought about who I was and who I had let myself become and what the difference was, and I decided that 67 was not too old to close the gap. Roland used to tell me, back when we were young men hauling freight in Cleveland, that the smartest thing a person could do was understand what they actually controlled. Not what they wished they controlled, not what they felt entitled to control. What was actually genuinely theirs to decide. I did not listen to that as well as I should have in the years between then and now. I spent too much of my energy trying to manage other people's choices instead of standing fully inside my own. The decision I made in that hospital room, to change the documents, to redirect what I had built toward people and places that would use it, that was not revenge. It was the first fully honest thing I had done in a long time. It required me to look at what my life had actually produced, not what I had hoped it would produce, and to choose accordingly. That kind of honesty takes something out of you and puts something better back. I'm still learning what that something is. The after-school kids at Vine Street are part of it. The veterans' housing work is part of it. Sitting on this porch watching the dogwood come back is part of it. Whatever comes next with Diane, and I do not know what that will be, I am going into it as the man I should have been all along, clear-eyed, unbought. Still standing, that is enough to work with. It always was.